How did you know that nursing was the right profession for you?
I was getting ready to go to college. I was a day before leaving my house. And I was downstairs in the basement. I was looking through this huge bookcase that we have down there just to take some good books with me that I would read during the semester. And I came across my dad's war journal, and I had never, ever seen this journal before. It was just in a little folder and it said H. Smith Shumway War Journal. So I opened it up and I remembered that about probably 3 or 4 months before, I was sitting in the living room and one of my friends said to me, "Your dad's blind." And I said, "What?" She said, "Your dad's blind." And it really struck me that my childhood had been different than other kids' childhood. Little kids had bells on their shoes not because all little kids had bells on their shoes, it's because their dads wouldn't step on them when they came into the house. And dads took their hands because they loved them and not because they needed their daughters to show them the way because they were blind and they didn't want to use their cane. All dads used canes, don't you know? But anyway, it was something that I was not aware of, really, that my dad absolutely could not see anything until I was a senior in high school and almost ready to graduate. So I find this war journal, I sit down on the floor, I begin to read it, and he talks about landing on D-Day in World War II, and then he talks about the explosion that happened about a month, 6 weeks later when he's going into France, going into Paris to free Paris from Germany, and he talks about the explosion and the landmine that blows up the tank that is right next to him. He blows up in the air, comes down and lands on the ground, and he realizes that he has a head injury, so he feels around his head and feels around his eyes and wipes this liquid out of his eyes and thinks that it's probably blood coming from his head. And I begin to cry, and I think, wiping tears out of my eyes, and I'm thinking of my dad's wiping blood out of his. And then as I read further in the journal, he talked about how the nurses took such great care of him in the hospital, and how kind they were, and how sensitive they were, and how helpful they were in taking care of him. And I decided then and there that I wanted to be a nurse, that I would have loved to have been there by him to help him learn how to use a cane, and I would have loved to have been a nurse there, helping him walk and learn how to walk again. His legs were very injured as well as his hands. Would have loved to have helped him learn how to read Braille, although I never learned how to read Braille myself because my dad wasn't blind. Who needed to read Braille? Anyway, that's how I decided to be a nurse. So I went to school. Instead of being undecided, I was able to say nursing student, and I was able to sign up for the appropriate classes right as a freshman, which was really helpful for me getting through school.
So we can blame Grandpa on your...
Yes, playing Grandpa.
Can you pull that picture of Grandpa by the cabinet?
Oh yeah, so here he is.
This is kind of special about how he helps the blind community in Wyoming. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
I think it's really cool.
So he was the state director for the state of Wyoming, the director for the blind, the deaf and the blind, and he took all of the blind in the early 50s. He worked in Baltimore first for 2 years, for 10 years, going into factory. His first job after being blind, he went into factories and would do a job on a factory line. And if he could perform the task as a blind person, then they would hire a blind veteran. So he got many, many blind people hired after World War II into factories and in Baltimore, Maryland. And he learned how to navigate the streets and was very independent in Baltimore. And after he was there for a couple of years, then he proposed to my mom because he knew he could support a family. He came to Wyoming. That was his next job, and he was the director for the deaf and blind in the state. And he formed a blind camp on Casper Mountain, and he brought blind adults for 2 weeks, and they lived in a community of all blind. They had a couple, maybe the cook was sighted, but I believe she was the only person that had sight on the hill. All the other people were blind, and they lived in cabins, they cooked food, they were taught by other blind people women were taught, and men probably too, were taught how to iron and how to cook food and activities of daily living, how to dress, how to match their clothes in the world. And they lived on this little mountain, and there were little trails that they had to navigate with the cane so they wouldn't be falling off the mountain. I think later maybe somebody built up some, put some barriers up so they were a little safer, but I don't think they had any accidents. And then after 2 weeks, the adults were there. Then they brought children up, and they had a children's blind camp for a week, and brought the children away from their sighted parents and their sighted siblings, and put them in an all-blind environment as well. He took all the blind kids out of school in Montana, in our state, out of Missoula, and brought them into public schools in Wyoming. And because it was one of the first mainstreaming, maybe the only, the very first mainstreaming effort to bring handicapped children into public schools in a state. And so he said that blind people need to learn how to live in a sighted world. Blind children need to learn how to live in a sighted world, because that's where you spend your whole life, is in a sighted world, not in a blind world. So yeah, he was an amazing man.
Maybe that's a little foreshadowing of another book to come.
Oh, yes. So during COVID time, I wrote 2 books, and they're just the bones of the book. The first one that's going to be coming out
Soon?
yeah, in the next few months, about the labor and delivery, Behind the Double Doors, about a labor and delivery nurse. The next book is Blind Soldier's Daughter, and it's about my life as a child, not knowing that my dad is blind, and how, as a child, my life was a little bit different than other sighted kids. And it's just it was a very fun read. It will be a fun read. And fun to write. Oh, of course, of course.